They called it a counter-narcotics mission. Venezuela called it an act of war. The Caribbean dawn was supposed to be quiet, a pale strip of orange gliding over calm waters. Then came the roar. 6 American Black Hawks slicing the morning sky, their rotors beating like war drums. Below, fishing boats rocked violently as the waves turned angry. Through the static of intercepted radio chatter, one word kept repeating, "Intercept! Intercept!" At 5:42 a.m., the helicopters broke formation, diving toward what Washington described as a suspected drug convoy drifting off the Venezuelan coast. The world would later learn there was no convoy, only a cluster of unarmed vessels carrying diesel and dried corn. Yet in those tense minutes, the men inside those choppers believed they were part of a righteous hunt. A spotlight pierced the haze. Orders were shouted. "Hold position! Confirm target!" But when the fog lifted, there was no cartel, no cocaine, no traffickers fleeing into the sea. Just Venezuelan fishermen frozen under the white glare, hands raised against the storm of foreign engines above them. In Caracas, radar operators watched the violation in real time. The dots on their screens, American, not Venezuelan, crossing invisible lines drawn in blood and history. "They're in our airspace," one officer whispered. "They're already here." By sunrise, the footage was viral. Cell phone clips of the hovering choppers flooded Latin social media feeds, captions seething with disbelief and fury. First Iraq, then Libya, now us? The U.S. Embassy called it a navigation error. But to a nation that had endured years of sanctions, shortages, and sabotage, it didn't feel like an accident. It felt like the prelude to something bigger, a move disguised as a mistake, a message cloaked in confusion. In a cafe overlooking the harbor, an old man stared at the sky and muttered, "They test our patience before they take our pride." And across the hemisphere, news anchors struggled to find the right words. A mission meant to fight drugs had somehow declared a new kind of war, one fought not with missiles, but with denials and maps, and what Washington said next sent shockwaves across Latin America. By mid-morning, the storm had shifted from the skies to the screens. Every news channel on both continents carried the same breaking headline. Pentagon confirms counter-narcotics operation near Venezuelan waters. At a podium draped in flags, a U.S. defense spokesperson adjusted his earpiece, smiled for the cameras, and read from a carefully prepared statement. "Our teams were conducting a coordinated anti-narcotics patrol with regional partners. Any temporary deviation into Venezuelan airspace was unintentional. The mission was, and remains, focused solely on disrupting transnational criminal networks." The words were measured, almost soothing, but behind them lurked the arrogance of a superpower that never apologized, only clarified. The camera panned across the press corps, pens scribbling, flashes popping. A journalist shouting, "So was Venezuela informed?" The spokesperson blinked, hesitated, then replied, "We follow standard protocols." Across the Caribbean, Caracas was anything but calm. In an emergency address, Venezuela's foreign minister stood before a trembling array of microphones, voice echoing through the marble halls of the Palacio de Miraflores. "Let me be clear," she declared, eyes blazing. This was no accident. This was surveillance. This was provocation. The United States violated our sovereignty, and then called it a mistake. Within hours, dueling maps appeared on television. Washington's flight path in blue, Caracas's radar logs in red. The lines didn't match. They crossed, overlapped, contradicted. One nation said error. The other said incursion. Analysts filled the airwaves, each with a theory and a motive. On CNN, a retired general leaned forward and said, "It's routine. The U.S. has operated in that corridor for years." On Telesur, a Venezuelan professor countered, "Routine? To whom? To the empire, maybe. To us, it's déjà vu, another foreign shadow over our skies." Every statement deepened the divide. European allies nodded politely toward Washington's explanation. Brazil and Colombia issued cautious support. Meanwhile, Mexico and Argentina called for restraint, warning against military theatrics disguised as moral crusades. Social media became the new battlefield. Hashtags like Protect Sovereignty and Stop the Cartels warred for dominance. One viral tweet read, "They say it's a drug war, but whose drugs and whose war?" In living rooms from Caracas to Chicago, ordinary people watched the same footage but saw different stories. To some, it was America the protector, keeping the hemisphere safe from traffickers. To others, it was America the aggressor, testing the boundaries of yet another country too poor to fight back. News commentators tried to strike balance, but balance itself became bias. Every phrase, unintentional violation, joint operation, defensive perimeter, sounded more like euphemisms than facts. And somewhere between the official statements and the outrage, truth began to dissolve into fog. Late that night, as the Pentagon issued one last memo calling for regional cooperation against the narcotics threat, a Venezuelan journalist named Lucia Torres reviewed raw footage frame by frame. Her hands trembled. Something didn't add up. A flight tag, a timestamp, a classified call sign that wasn't supposed to exist. She leaned closer to the screen, heart pounding. The mission hadn't followed drug routes at all. It had flown directly over oil fields, Venezuela's last functioning export lifeline. Lucia pressed pause, stared at the frozen image and whispered, "So this is what they're after." But beneath the press briefings and polished statements, one file told a very different story. Empires rarely announce themselves. They don't march with banners anymore. They move with spreadsheets, contracts, and polite smiles. And in Washington, the playbook hasn't changed, only the language. They called it democracy promotion in the 1980s, counterterrorism in the 2000s, drug interdiction today. But the script remains the same. Find a justification, project virtue, secure access. Every new administration swears it's different, and every operation starts with a promise: freedom, safety, order, until the borders blur and the oil maps resurface. The ghosts of Panama still whisper through this doctrine. 1989. Operation Just Cause. The stated mission: remove a corrupt dictator and protect democracy. The result: entire neighborhoods flattened, hundreds dead, and a U.S. flag fluttering over a smoldering skyline. The drugs didn't disappear. The loyalty did. Then came Plan Colombia, a billion-dollar crusade to combat narcotics that left rural farmers displaced and private security firms richer than ever. The coca fields shifted, the traffickers adapted, but the contracts, those stayed. Stability, the document said. Stability for whom? By the 2000s, the narrative evolved. Iraq was the new theater. Weapons of mass destruction became the holy chant. We're liberating the oppressed, they said. Liberation looked like convoys of armored vehicles and burning cities reflected in soldiers' visors. Libya followed, cloaked in the same moral armor: humanitarian intervention. NATO jets roared, the regime fell, and chaos took its place. And each time, when the dust settled, the oil wells were the first to be guarded. Venezuela had watched it all unfold from across the ocean, taking notes, learning the rhythm of American justification. And now, when the helicopters appeared in its skies, the pattern felt eerily familiar. Inside the Pentagon's maze of glass and fluorescent light, the machinery of empire hummed quietly. Think tanks published policy briefs warning of Venezuelan destabilization. Lobbyists hosted luncheons on energy security, defense. Contractors pitched regional monitoring systems over catered buffets. It was bureaucracy masquerading as benevolence, power disguised as partnership. Behind closed doors, slideshows and intelligent summaries reduced nations to bullet points. Oil reserves strategic, government unstable, opportunity high. Decisions about entire peoples were made between coffee refills and classified PowerPoints. No faces, no names, just objectives. A retired intelligence officer once admitted, half proudly, half weary, "We never invade to conquer. We enter to manage." For Washington, Venezuela wasn't just a nation. It was a resource map, wrapped in a flag, a test site for soft power, economic pressure, and digital propaganda. The drug war narrative was the ribbon tied neatly on top, moral cover for strategic hunger. In this quiet empire, the generals didn't always wear uniforms. They wore suits, carried policy memos, and sat on corporate boards. They authored phrases like democratic realignment and enhanced cooperation, each word polished enough to hide the machinery beneath it, the extraction deals, the regime change budgets, the quiet funding of civil society groups that happened to destabilize the wrong leaders. Cable networks played their role, too, repeating official lines with patriotic music and somber anchors. The moral scaffolding was always the same. We must act, but never ask. Intervene, but never introspect. And every time the justification shifted, the victims stayed the same. Brown, poor, hopeful, and expendable. Yet history, however rewritten, has memory. Across the global south, whispers have turned into lessons. The pattern is visible now. The smile before the sanction, the handshake before the coup. And every time the empire denies it, another archive leaks, another whistleblower speaks, another community counts its graves. While the policymakers debated maps and missions, the real Venezuela breathed in the shadows, not in the language of policy, but in the pulse of survival. In the hills above Caracas, a nurse named Daniela stood before an empty medicine cabinet. Plastic bottles lined the shelves like ghosts of a system that once worked. She tore open her last pack of gauze, cut each strip in half, and whispered to a patient, "Don't worry. I'll find more tomorrow." Tomorrow. That fragile promise every Venezuelan had learned to make without believing. Outside the hospital, the city hummed with contradictions. Billboards boasted about sovereignty, while bread lines stretched around the block. A man played the cuatro on a corner, singing love songs to a crowd that smiled through hunger. Children darted between them, chasing a deflated soccer ball painted in the colors of the flag. Down on the coast, a fisherman named Rafael pushed his small boat into the surf at dawn. The water was his lifeline and his fear. Overhead, drones traced lazy circles, their faint buzz merging with the cries of seagulls. Some days they came from the cartel routes. Other days, from the north. Rafael never knew which, but he knew enough to lower his eyes when he saw the metallic glint. "At least the sea still feeds us," he muttered, though even that wasn't true anymore. Diesel had doubled again. Nets tore faster than he could repair them. The currents, like politics, were shifting against him. In the barrios, resilience became a quiet religion. Mothers traded sugar for rice. Barbers cut hair by candlelight when power outages rolled through. And the old women still gathered every evening to clap from their balconies at 6. A ritual of defiance that said, "We are still here." For years, the country had been painted in broad, cruel strokes. Failed state, dictatorship, socialism gone wrong. But behind every label was a face. A mechanic rebuilding a generator from scrap. A student printing flyers about peace. A grandmother refusing to sell her wedding ring even when her pension vanished. They were not naive. They knew the system was broken. But they also knew that the story being told about them, a land of chaos needing rescue, was another kind of weapon. Daniela's brother, a teacher, often joked, "In the U.S. they study economics. Here, we survive it." Yet beneath the gallows, humor lay exhaustion, not only from shortages and sanctions, but from being turned into symbols in someone else's narrative. Every time a new headline appeared, humanitarian crisis in Caracas, U.S. moves to restore order, the people it described could only watch, unconsulted, as the world debated their fate. On television, analysts drew lines through their neighborhoods. On social media, their pain became content, and yet dignity remained. In small acts of rebellion, in kindness that no policy could measure. Daniela began saving a vial of saline each week from her shifts, quietly building a stash for children in the cancer ward. Rafael started teaching the neighborhood boys how to fish with string when diesel ran out. A barber named Jorge hung a sign outside his shop. "Cuts payable in kindness or coffee." This was the other Venezuela, the one that refused to collapse because it had nothing left to lose but its pride. Still, the strain was visible. Sanctions starved not the powerful but the patient. Inflation erased savings faster than words could describe. Propaganda painted villains on both sides. Some called the government corrupt, others called the opposition traitors, and in between the people stood like hostages caught in an argument that never ended. One evening, as the sun melted into the Caribbean horizon, Daniela's mother sat by the window and whispered, "At least the sky is still ours." The words hung heavy, defiant yet fragile, like the flag fluttering above the government palace that no longer inspired faith. But even skies can be claimed. The next morning, Raphael saw new contrails streaking across the clouds, sharp white lines carving messages he couldn't read. On the radio, a commentator's voice trembled. "Unidentified aircraft over national waters. Pentagon sources say it's part of a new regional security initiative." The streets of Caracas buzzed again, not with hope, but with rumor. Operation Sentinel. That was the name whispered in cafes, on buses, in the dark corners of telegram channels. The Americans were coming back, not with boots, but with sensors, satellites, and sanctions sharper than bullets. In the marketplaces, the price of flour doubled overnight. In the hospitals, rumors spread faster than disease. "They'll take what's left," someone said. "Or protect it," another replied. Nobody knew anymore. But what everyone felt, from the nurse with her half-roll of gauze to the fisherman scanning the sky, was the same uneasy electricity. History was moving again, and it was moving toward them. And soon their lives would become pawns in a much larger game, when Washington unveiled Operation Sentinel. It started as a rumor and became a countdown. Operation Sentinel. The name alone carried a chill, a promise of watchfulness that felt more like warning. Within days, American warships appeared on satellite imagery, stationed just outside Venezuelan waters. The Pentagon called it routine patrol. Caracas called it a siege. Television anchors rehearsed calm tones as maps filled the screen. Blue lines for security corridors, red ones for sovereignty zones. Between them lay only a sliver of sea, but on that sliver hung the fate of two nations. At 6:00 a.m., the first U.S. reconnaissance plane was sighted over the Caribbean. Its wings glinted like a blade in the sun. In Miraflores Palace, Venezuelan defense officials crowded around screens, their faces lit by radar glow. "They're testing range," one murmured. "No," said another. "They're testing us." By midday, Washington released its statement. Operation Sentinel will ensure freedom of navigation and disrupt narcotics trafficking in the southern Caribbean. The words were diplomatic perfection, sterile, rehearsed and impossible to disprove. Behind them, a fleet of drones and frigates formed an invisible perimeter, watching every movement that dared to rise from Venezuelan ports. The next morning, Caracas retaliated with language of its own. President Ortega, flanked by military officers, faced the cameras. "They say they come for drugs," he said, voice tightening. "But they come for control." The clip played on loop across Latin America, a soundbite turned slogan, a defiance too small to stop ships but large enough to ignite hearts. In Washington, press briefings turned tense. Reporters pressed for evidence of traffickers. Officials spoke in circles, citing classified intelligence. On cable news, panels erupted. A retired admiral thundered, "We can't allow a narco-state to threaten hemispheric stability." A journalist shot back, "But who decides what stability looks like?" Meanwhile, social media burned. Operation Sentinel trended beside truck hands off Venezuela. Memes mocked the mission, cartoons of American eagles peering through binoculars at oil rigs. Others defended it fiercely, claiming the U.S. was finally taking responsibility for the region. Truth and propaganda wrestled for the same timeline. Each tweet a bullet in a digital war. Tensions surged offshore. Venezuelan fighter jets scrambled twice in 1 week after unidentified aircraft veered too close to their borders. American pilots claimed they were shadowed aggressively. Radio exchanges leaked, clipped, formal, chilling. "Unidentified aircraft, you are entering restricted airspace. Turn back immediately. This is U.S. Navy Alpha 1. We are in international waters." Not anymore. The silence that followed said more than words. Could daunt embassies began recalling ambassadors for consultation. Fuel. Shortages worsened as insurers raised premiums on ships docking in Venezuelan ports. Economists warned of a blockade without declaration. The foreign press called it anti-drug diplomacy. Venezuelan papers called it 21st century colonialism. For ordinary citizens, it was déjà vu. They'd seen this movie before. The build-up, the justification, the eventual accident that turned into an intervention. Families stocked up on rice. Soldiers slept in their boots. Churches filled with quiet prayers that history might skip this chapter. And through it all, the information war raged. One night, a CNN anchor introduced a Pentagon analyst who smiled as he explained, "Operation Sentinel is purely defensive. No one's talking about invasion." Moments later, on a Venezuelan stream, a local host laughed bitterly. "If this is defense, why are there ships facing us?" Back in Caracas, tension was a living thing. The hum of drones had become background noise. The city learned to ignore it like distant thunder. But beneath the calm, there was fear and a grim kind of pride. Even surrounded, they still stood. The world watched the standoff unfold, analysts calling it a test of endurance. Each day brought another headline, another denial, another inch of uncertainty. And yet, for all the noise, one question hung unanswered. What was Sentinel really guarding? No one knew, until a single press conference changed everything. Because in one stunning moment, a Venezuelan general flipped the entire narrative upside down. The broadcast began without warning. No music, no preamble, just the flicker of a camera struggling to focus. Across Venezuela, televisions crackled to life. Radios cut mid-sentence. Even the hum of traffic seemed to pause. On screen stood General Rafael Torres, uniform pressed, medals gleaming like ghosts of forgotten wars. Behind him, the Venezuelan flag hung motionless, a splash of red and gold in the sterile blue light. His eyes were steady, his jaw clenched. "Compatriots," he began, voice low but carrying. "For too long we have been told to stay quiet, to believe the story written for us by others. But tonight, that story ends." The room around him was filled with reporters, soldiers, technicians, all watching the same trembling hands lift a stack of documents. He held them up like a confession. The air was electric. "These," he said, "are intercepted transmissions, direct from the U.S. Southern Command. Their mission was not to stop narcotics. It was to map our oil terminals, our power grids, and our ports." The screen behind him flickered to life. Grainy audio, blurred text, time-stamped coordinates. A robotic American voice echoed through the feed. "Priority target, Zulia Basin Pipeline. Objective, confirm structural vulnerabilities. Civilian presence, acceptable risk." Gasps erupted. Some thought it was fabricated. Others didn't care. The symbolism was enough. For years, Venezuelans had lived under sanctions and shortages. Now, for the first time, the suffering had a face, a voice, a plan. For the first time in years, the narrator intoned, the people cheered, not out of hatred, but out of clarity. Across the country, cafes turned their televisions toward the street. Crowds gathered, nurses in scrubs, taxi drivers, students clutching flags. The broadcast became communal theater, a nation's wound finally voiced aloud. General Torres continued. "They call it Operation Sentinel? But we have seen sentinels before, in Baghdad, in Tripoli, in Panama. Every time they come to protect, they leave with what was ours." His words struck like a drumbeat, steady and merciless. "We are not perfect, but we are sovereign." Outside the palace, car horns blared in rhythm. Fireworks cracked across the skyline, a strange kind of celebration, defiance disguised as joy. On social media, clips of Torres holding the papers looped endlessly. Hashtags exploded. Not a drug war, hands off Venezuela, the oil files. Within minutes, the footage crossed oceans. In New York, CNN anchors stumbled mid-segment. One of them blinked, reading the teleprompter twice. "Breaking news! Venezuela claims to have intercepted U.S. military communications." The newsroom filled with half-finished sentences, analysts grasping for context. At the White House, chaos erupted. The press secretary, mid-briefing, was handed a folded note. Cameras zoomed in as her eyes darted across the words. She froze. "We are aware of the allegations," she managed, "but we have not verified any such communications." The questions came like bullets. Is this authentic? Was the operation really about drugs? Did the U.S. target oil assets? She smiled thinly. Next question. But there was no next question. The room was already roaring. Back in Caracas, the general didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply lowered the papers and whispered, "We are done being the villain in someone else's story." Then he walked off camera. No anthem, no applause. Just silence, and the kind that follows revelation. The silence didn't last. Within hours, foreign correspondents were streaming live from embassy gates. Washington called it an act of propaganda. The EU demanded an inquiry. Latin American leaders, some allies, some rivals, issued statements laced with caution. In Mexico City, a journalist murmured into her mic, "This is the moment the narrative turned." In Bogotá, a crowd gathered outside the U.S. consulate, chanting, "Somos dueños de nuestra tierra. We own our land." And yet, amid the applause, doubt began to whisper. Intelligence analysts noted inconsistencies in the leaked files. The timestamps didn't align. Some voices sounded synthetic. Could it have been staged? Could Caracas have doctored the evidence? The narrator cut in softly, almost mournful. Truth, once weaponized, rarely survives the war it starts. Still, for ordinary Venezuelans, the authenticity mattered less than the audacity. For one brief night, the empire blinked, and that was victory enough. Footage replayed across news networks like a cinematic montage, the general's hand trembling, the press secretary's stunned face, the headlines morphing in real time. Drug war? Power grab? Crisis of credibility. Even American audiences felt the tremor. Protesters gathered outside federal buildings holding signs reading, "Not in our name." A congresswoman tweeted, "If the leaks are true, this isn't counter-narcotics, it's resource warfare." Late that night, the president appeared before the press. The backdrop was the usual: flags, polished wood, calm authority. "Let me be clear," he began, his tone slow and deliberate. "The United States does not target civilian infrastructure. We fight crime, not countries." But even his confidence seemed brittle, as if every word was a stone he wasn't sure would hold. The camera caught the micro-hesitation in his eyes, a blink too long, a breath too shallow. Around the world, that blink became a meme. By morning, the internet had split in two. One side hailed Torres as a patriot who exposed imperial deceit. The other branded him a manipulator, feeding his people a forged fairy tale. Global opinion fractured like glass. Yet, regardless of who was right, something irreversible had happened. The spell had broken. The myth of pure intention shattered on live television. In Caracas, Torres disappeared from public view. Some said he was reassigned, others whispered he'd been silenced. But his words lingered in graffiti on alley walls. "They call it protection. We call it plunder." The narrator's tone softened, almost cinematic in reflection. Empires fall not when they lose wars, but when they lose the story. For Venezuela, that night wasn't a triumph of power, but of perception. For the first time in a long time, the world wasn't watching their collapse. It was watching their defiance. Crowds gathered again the next morning, waving flags not in celebration, but in defiant hope. Somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of helicopters returned, but this time, people didn't flinch. The general's revelation had changed something fundamental. Fear had learned its limits. And yet, as the sun rose over the Caribbean, another kind of uncertainty crept in. Because in the swirl of data leaks, doctored tapes, and political theater, a darker thought began to emerge, whispered first by journalists, then by governments. What if the leak was planted? What if the outrage was designed? What if both sides were lying? The narrator's final words lingered over the static hum of an ending transmission. And as the footage spread worldwide, a new question emerged. What if both sides were lying? The memo was real, but not recent. Stamped, yellowed, and brittle at the edges, It dated back nearly 30 years. The signature at the bottom belonged to a general long dead, the language unmistakable. Operation Sentinel. Long-term strategic containment under narcotics pretext. It wasn't a blueprint for this crisis. It was a ghost from another one. Proof not of a conspiracy in the present, but of a pattern that had never died. The revelation rippled slowly, quietly, like the tide pulling back after a storm. News anchors softened their voices. Commentators paused before they spoke. For a brief moment, the noise fell silent, replaced by something heavier, recognition. The narrator's tone lowered, calm, deliberate. Sometimes history doesn't repeat. It just refuses to end. In Caracas, the people didn't celebrate. They simply went on living, with the same stubborn rhythm that had carried them through years of shortages, sanctions, and propaganda. A nurse walked to work through the dawn haze, past walls still painted with the general's face. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. She had medicine to ration, patience to see. A fisherman pushed his boat out to sea, tracing the same waters where foreign ships once prowled under the banner of protection. And in a crowded alley, children kicked a worn-out soccer ball, their laughter echoing against murals of oil rigs glowing at sunset. Life continued, not triumphant but undefeated. The narrator's voice hovered gently over the images. In every empire's story, the language of protection hides the logic of control. But nations don't die from power. They die when their people stop believing in their own. Across the hemisphere, debates raged on. Scholars dissected motives. Journalists parsed every word. Politicians spun every outcome. But the story's center had shifted. It no longer belonged to generals or presidents or think tanks. It belonged to those who lived beneath the headlines, the hands that built, healed, and endured. For them, the truth of the memo wasn't revelation, it was confirmation. What they had felt in silence for decades was now written in ink. That the war on drugs was never just about drugs, and sovereignty was never just about borders. Footage rolled, crowded markets reopening, street vendors bartering with quiet smiles, old women lighting candles by cracked windows. Ordinary defiance, quiet, consistent, immortal. The narrator continued, voice steady as dusk. Empires speak in centuries, but resilience lives day to day. In Washington, a new press release promised transparency. In Caracas, another speech vowed resistance. The cycle continued, words orbiting truth without ever landing. But for those watching from afar, those who had followed the story from the first headline to the last hashtag, something had changed. They saw through the choreography now. They recognized how fear was framed as safety, how intervention was branded as aid. And for a fleeting moment, even the most skeptical viewer could feel it, that flicker of clarity that once lit revolutions, the knowledge that no nation, no empire, no algorithm can truly own dignity. The camera panned one last time across the Venezuelan coast. Orange light shimmering on oil rigs, sea wind bending flags, children's laughter cutting through static radio chatter. The narrator's final words rose like a slow tide, measured and resolute. Maybe that's what they fear most. Not defiance, not dissent, but endurance. Because power fades, headlines fade, but the will to remain unbroken, that's what empires can never conquer. A pause. A breath, the sound of waves against steel. And maybe that's why the world keeps watching Venezuela. They called it a drug war. Now, after everything, the raids, the revelations, the leaks, the lies, those words sound almost fragile. Because it was never just about drugs. It was about narrative, about who gets to define justice, and who gets branded the villain. From the first helicopter hum over Caribbean waters to the final headline rewritten by public outrage, one truth stands out. Power doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a logo, sometimes it speaks through a press release, and sometimes it hides behind good intentions. The narrator's tone softens, not accusing, but awakening. History isn't written by the loudest voices. It's written by those who endure long enough to be heard. Images flicker. The nurse tending her patients, the fisherman on the dawn tide, children running barefoot past murals of defiance. Ordinary faces that never made the news, yet carry the weight of a nation. So the next time they tell you it's a war for peace or for safety or for freedom, ask whose freedom they mean. Ask who profits from the protection. And ask who gets left behind, a quiet beat. Then the call, simple, clear, unwavering. If you believe truth shouldn't need permission, share this story. The screen fades to black, a faint echo of static humming beneath a haunting score. White text appears against the darkness. Target Venezuela. The war for hearts, minds, and sovereignty continues. And then silence, the kind that doesn't end a story, but dares the viewer to start thinking.